There are some useful principles you can learn from playing video games that will teach you skills in the real world, but they're kind of fuzzy skills, but they're very, very useful. I want to talk about a couple terms that people use in finance and also sometimes in engineering that apply to games that I'm sure you've realized yourself. The big ones I want to cover are inductive reasoning, adverse selection, and the first mover advantage. These are principles that apply to basically any situation where there are multiple counterparties that are making decisions that can potentially impact each other. Really quickly, I'll give you an example of each of them. Inductive thinking. What is a case where you can do this in World of Warcraft? You may be familiar with the fight Saffron in Nax Ramus, and most people approach this fight in an absolutely insane way. Let me explain what's insane about it. If your guild is incredibly competent, then you only optimize for killing the boss as fast as possible. So there's not necessarily a reason to use inductive logic here. But if your guild is having a hard time killing this boss, let me very easily explain how you should actually think about it. You have a dragon. It auto attacks for more damage than nearly any other individual mob in the entire game, and everyone in your group takes a certain amount of damage per unit time. These are the two mechanics you actually have to contend with. And what people normally do is that they use magical woo thinking with their plan on how they're going to progress on this boss, which is dumb. Let's focus on what really wipes you in Saffron. It's either your tank falls over, or the damage that's done to your entire raid through the frost is what just slowly ooms your healers, unless they are very bad and they just don't hit their buttons. So, how would I solve this? How could you solve this with a raid group of a bunch of morons or unprepared people? This is the real problem you solve on Saffron to kill the boss. You simply need to make sure that given infinite time, your healers would not run out of mana and no one would die. And this sounds like a no brainer, but you see, this is how people screw it up all the time. You know that healers die on this fight, and you know that the reason that they die is because they spend too much mana or don't hit their buttons. Let's assume you can get them to hit their buttons. So they're only going to die if they run out of mana. Why would they run out of mana? It's because there's too many people taking damage in the raid. How could you limit this? Take less people into the raid. Yes, yes. 25 man, your 40 man Saffron. Why? Well, you're going to make the raid do probably 60-70% less DPS. That is going to suck. However, you're also going to make the healers spend about half as much mana, which means that most likely, no matter what your current problems are on SAF, they would not have an issue actually healing. Then all they have to actually handle themselves is coming up with a healing rotation that sustains themselves. This is a very easy problem for them to solve because you can simply engage the boss, die, and then stand close enough to get hit by the aura, but not close enough to actually re engage the boss. So your healers should have no problem developing their own solution to healing themselves and a couple other people that would never them. Now, if you approach the boss this way, what you'd find is that the more healers you have in relation to everybody else in the raid, the easier the fight is. Of course, you probably can't get 18, 19 healers to hop on, especially if your guild's having a hard time, but you could get 15 DPS players to sit out the fight. They could kill themselves prior to the fight, or you could put them into groups and not allow them to be healed. You see, most people, the way that they would think about Saffron would be in an iterative manner, and they're going to think things like, how could I get the raid to take less and less damage? And so they look at very expensive, hard to solve problems, like getting incredibly expensive consumables and gear. This is very, very silly. One reason it's silly is because the actual value of your resistance scales quadratically with the amount you have it. You might not believe me or necessarily understand this, but think about how armor works in video games. Every video game, it's actually the same. Why is it that in League of Legends, there is diminishing returns on armor in the same way there is in WoW? Well, it's because if there was not diminishing returns on a percent reduction, then it would scale absolutely ridiculously high. You have to imagine 1% less damage taken when you have 98% resistance with half the damage you take, right? Because you would normally receive 100 damage. 98% of it will be mitigated. Now you're receiving 2 damage. If you gained an extra 1% mitigation, instead of receiving 2, you receive a 1. wild. And if you went from 99% to 100, you go from killable to immortal. This is why all games put diminishing returns on stuff. However, there's not a lot of diminishing returns actually on resistances. There is a hard cap at 75%, which partially resolves this problem. But as you get more resistance, every additional point actually counts for more. And no one really takes advantage of this. You'd be way better off, for example, telling all your DPS players that have nearly BIS resistance gear that you will be able to fight on Saffron, and you will receive extra loot for providing more value to the team, and having everyone who isn't at a near capped amount just simply die before you start the fight. But nobody approaches it this way. Almost everyone says, hey, everybody get 150 resistance, which is silly. It's not even at the soft cap amount. What does soft cap mean? It means that the spell cannot possibly tick for certain values. So if you are at 66% of the maximum resistance level for a mob that's casting abilities on you, then you will never get hit for 100% of the damage. You will always, no matter what, at least have a 25% partial resist. But people don't notice these things because they're not thinking inductively. It's very complicated to come to the right solution iteratively on some types of problems. If you're a programmer, you'll know this from using the concept of recursion. But we can ditch induction for now. I hope you see that sometimes you can solve the problem in reverse and it actually makes it easier. Let's talk about another concept that I think you're probably way more familiar with: the first mover advantage. This basically means that you're always in a hurry. You're literally at all times in a hurry, because most of the time the game isn't like chess, and it doesn't even have to be a game. It could just be making decisions in the real world. Usually you're allowed to take actions whenever you want, and it doesn't matter if somebody else is. So being first is an enormous edge. Let's talk about parsing. People have gotten more gear over the course of the phase. They always do. However, it gets harder and harder to parse, and the amount of gear you get is not going to make it easier. If you want to get as good of parses as possible, the easiest time to get them is the first week, the second week, the third week, and every week after, it's getting harder and harder. You're literally always in a rush at all times. This applies to the real world also. It's not just in games where there aren't turns. For example, if you try to get very serious about your career while you're in college, it's actually much, much easier. For example, when I was in school, I sent out 2,000 applications before I got an internship. However, when I did get an internship, I got offers at Microsoft, NVIDIA, an algorithmic trading firm, ServiceNow, and a couple other companies all simultaneously. The way that actually played out is I had nothing, and I failed probably 45 interview sequences before I actually got any offers. And then I finally acquired the skills to get the job, and I got all of those offers simultaneously in my final semesters. And if I tried to instead screw around in college and focus on, actually, let's say this, if I focused on my grades, I almost failed out of college. I almost failed out of high school. I had super, super low grades in both. And I decided, in high school, I was just being an idiot. But in college, I decided I'm going to focus on interviews. If instead I wanted to get good grades, graduate, get a more average job, and then slowly build up the skills to try to get into an elite tech firm, it would have been much, much harder. You see, the requirements scale very quickly when you're out of school for some of those jobs. And if you don't try to get it early, it's much more difficult. And this is true with so many things in life. It's going to be true when you're playing a video game. If you're trying to make a guild, making it when a server is fresh is easier. If you want to do well in any kind of ranked activity where there's historical data, so like getting in earlier, like parsing, you don't have to be evaluated by future contestants. First mover advantage. In a fight in the real world, the person who throws a punch first usually wins. All of these places, it's very, very important that you act. But really, I think the takeaway is that you need to be really, really aggressive. You have to have a bias for action at all times, because if you're not making moves, you're actually falling behind, especially because real life isn't turn-based. The final term I want to talk about is adverse selection, and it has to do with plans where when you're wrong about your assumptions, you get nailed. Let's talk about a way people like to trade stocks. You'll see this on Wall Street Bets. You may have heard the term "don't catch a falling knife" before. What does this really mean? It means that if you think that buying the dip is a great idea at all times. You know what happens when you're wrong? Like when you're right, when there's random processes going on and the price is just fluctuating, buying the dip is actually killer. And if you wanted to backtest buying the dip on stocks that never went to zero, you would probably actually do pretty well unless it was a very efficiently priced stock like the S&P 500 ETF. If you bought something like that, it's very efficiently priced, and trying to buy the dip will not really work. But maybe if you wanted to buy some lower cap stock that there's not literally hundreds of thousands of people trading every day, what would happen if you try to buy the dip? Well, you're going to notice that usually the dip is a random process, and so your returns are going to be pretty smooth and going up. But every once in a while, adverse selection will screw you because you'll see the dip is for a reason, and you will buy and buy and buy and buy and buy and buy until it hits zero, and then you're out of the game. You have no more money and you're not allowed to play anymore. And this happens in the real world too. You can make decisions where you will make it so in the short term, you look pretty smart. And in the long term, randomness will murder you. This could happen with inviting people to your group, socially or professionally, that you think seem like they do a really good job, but they give you a little bit of the ick. You're a little worried. They seem like they're risk takers. These kinds of people could be awesome to bet on in the short term. And in the long term, it's going to be a big problem. You'll see this a lot with people's dating preferences too, in my opinion. If you are trying to meet people and you think that they seem really cool, but they may just be a little too crazy every once in a great while, well, what if they're a little crazy for like a week straight and then all the work you guys have put in together is destroyed? There's so many ways that you can screw yourself by not thinking about how you can adversely select against what you really want. You could see this in the auction house too. People will try to buy and sell items and they'll assume that all price fluctuations are kind of random. There's inflation in the game, so of course prices should trend up. And yes, normally that's going to be true, and the WoW market is very, very inefficient. So if you're using almost any logic at all, you can quite likely beat the market. But if you try to just buy things as they go down, you're going to notice that some of them never return. Things like Crusader Orbs, yeah, you want to just keep on buying those. Maybe your idea would make sense. However, if there's a bunch of bots in Stratholme, perhaps the price going down is actually a function of them infinitely juicing the market. And perhaps they will never stop doing that because they make most of their gold off vendoring things and selling the items for raw gold. So they're actually not fussed at all about the idea that these orbs may become worthless one day. That'd mean that if you invested in them, you'd probably get absolutely railed. But it also means that if you, for example, were monitoring the price of gold on a daily basis and you notice that these orbs were very low, perhaps you see that the price of gold spikes. Maybe you go on botter forums and you see people are talking about a large ban wave. Well, then now you have an information advantage. You could buy them and it would actually make sense and you'd nearly certainly make money. And there's been lots of times that this has happened in WoW. If you were monitoring the prices of gold and the behavior of botters, you could very easily make insane profits on the things that they farm on accident, because most of the things they farm are farmed on accident. They don't really want to deal with the auction house. It's very hard to automate that and have these characters run around and interact with each other and check the mail. They're not into that. They want to vendor stuff. And so nearly any item that they farm, unless they are bots that are fly hacking around the world and getting herbs and mining nodes, which are not the majority of bots, they're not going to ever really stop their farming behaviors because they just want to get access to the easy gold. It's easy to automate that. That's really what they're doing. And all of this really plays into the idea that you should be trying to figure out how all the things that you engage your time with work, whether or not you think that an idea is opposing to viewpoints you have. For example, let's say that you hate the idea of people doing real money trading and WoW, it really bugs you. Well, probably you'd benefit from knowing how to make more gold a legitimate way in the game then. And if you had a lot of knowledge about botters, like you went on botting forums and you had a little bit of an idea of how the bots were made and if people were worried about ban waves, then potentially you could actually very accurately predict prices. Let's talk about that Crusader Orb situation. If you were in my situation and you thought it's very interesting to know what accounts are sold for, what gold is sold for, how people make bots, and how botters communicate with each other, then you'd know that on websites like Owned Core, people will talk about, oh, there's a ban wave going out. So if you saw then, okay, Gold prices are spiking. Botters are apparently saying that they're getting banned. All right. Well, most of the Crusader orbs on the auction house are farmed by these guys, so it's quite likely the price should spike up. And it wouldn't take a genius to do this. And in reality, you could buy almost anything and make money if you knew that this was the case. But if you think, why would I ever look into this because I'm not interested in buying accounts or buying gold? Well, okay, then you can just miss out. And the same thing can go with beliefs in the real world. I'm not going to talk about anything political, but there are definitely things that people say on the both sides of the aisle that are sometimes true. One I would say is we should all agree that getting respiratory viruses can have long term ramifications on your health, beyond potentially killing you if you have some other comorbidity. And also that there are side effects of medications, and you should be considering if you really need them. But a lot of people want to not investigate as much stuff as they can when it relates to them, and that is silly. So definitely in the video game, at least, you should try to know what all the good and bad actors are doing, and you should try to understand the idiots and the people you think are geniuses, because there's so many ways that you could potentially give yourself a little bit of an advantage. And since, like many things in life, it's not a zero-sum game, getting this advantage that might seem just like a little bit could scale up to actually be a lot. How awesome would it have been if in the final phases of Classic in 2021 during Nax, you had known that all these botters were going to get banned halfway through Nax, and you could have bought the dip there. You could have like 30x'd your gold so easily, and then maybe you could have spent the entirety of Burning Crusade doing things with people you like and never worrying about farming and not buying gold and risking your account. But you'd never know that unless you're going and trying to be very curious all the time. So maybe be a little more curious. And don't underestimate how you can learn things in video games that are practical for the real world.